Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen just held a mysterious Jekyll Island type of emergency meeting with bank regulators.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen convened financial regulators this afternoon.
I'm going to explain what I think they were talking about behind closed doors and why it will lead to the Fed pivoting, dropping interest rates within the next 90 days. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the QE paradox. Let's start by going over a couple charts that helps you better understand how banks make money. This is the current yield curve. At the front, we've got the Fed funds overnight rate, and then I just put the 10-year and the 30-year. On the left, we go from 0% interest up to 5%. Most of you know the way banks make money is they borrow short-term at lower rates, and they lend long-term at higher rates, and they pocket the spread. Okay, well, what does this yield curve look like right now? It's inverted, which means the front end of the curve, the shorter term interest rates, are higher than the longer term interest rates. So how on earth do banks make money in this type of environment? The answer? Usually they don't. But now let's go over to this next chart that shows what the bank's yield curve actually looks like right now. And we're going to go into why this is such an anomaly situation. So their deposit rate that they're paying you on a savings account, let's say, is maybe 50 basis points, especially with the big banks. But the 10-year Treasury is still roughly the same yield at about 3.5%. The 30-year, roughly the same, just like we had in the previous chart. So since they are paying you such a measly 50 basis points on your deposits, their yield curve is actually steep. So they can borrow from you for basically free and lend long, let's say a mortgage, and actually pocket a tidy profit. So the next question becomes, how is this possible? How is the real yield curve dramatically inverted, but the bank's curve that they deal with their business model, very steep, therefore very profitable? Let's go to this next chart. We go all the way back to 1994 to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 up to $7,000. Now this chart you're going to find very fascinating. It's actually how much interest you would make with a $100,000 portfolio. And it also includes where the CPI was during that specific year. So check this out. In 1994, on a typical savings account of $100,000, you would make about $4,000 in interest. But the CPI that year, according to the government, I know they fudged the numbers, but let's just go with it for this chart so you understand the concept. The CPI was, let's say, 2.9%. So you were actually making more interest on your savings deposit than the current rate of consumer price inflation. Now, it gets a lot bigger. It actually gets pretty good here for the saver. Let's look at 2000 as an example. There, the official inflation rate was, let's say, 2.5, but you were getting about 6% on your savings. So every single year, you're pocketing $6,000 for a $100,000 account, way higher than the rate of consumer price inflation. And it was the same all the way till we got to the GFC. But then we get this line in the sand. It's called quantitative easing. And we're going to get into these technical terms here in just a moment. Nada and mucho. So what happened during quantitative easing is they flush the system with bank reserves. So this means the banks no longer have to compete for your deposits. So in other words, they don't have to pay you any interest. And we can see that reflected in this chart. So at the beginning of 2008, end of 2007, savers were getting about 5%. Then we fast forward to 2009, and they're getting maybe 25 basis points. But the CPI, as you can tell by this blue line, hasn't changed that much at all. So now you go from increasing your purchasing power by having savings to a point where your purchasing power is decreasing just by placing your money in the local bank. Oh, but wait, there is more. Unfortunately, it gets much, much worse when we zoom in on 2023. So right now, you're still getting about the same 0.5%, 50 basis points on your savings. But the rate of inflation, as the government would admit to, is 6%. So look at this delta. You're losing about 6% of the purchasing power of your savings every single year. Well, what's happening is most people are waking up to this. They're saying, whoa, time out here. No. I'm not going to play your game. Why on earth should I keep my money in a bank when I can just put it in a money market fund and make, let's say, 4.5%? Or I can just put it into a T-bill and make maybe 5%. So all of you watching this video, the average Joe and Jane, have a decision to make. Do you want to keep your hard-earned savings in a bank where you're losing 6% per year, or do you want to take it out of the bank where you're only losing 1% per year? It's an easy question to answer. This is what we call a no-brainer, another technical term for you. Obviously, you're going to move your money out of the bank as soon as you can. But wait a minute, let's think this through. If you take your money out of the bank and put it into a money market fund, it most likely goes from the reserve account with your bank down into what is called the reverse repo account, still on the Fed's balance sheet. But you see, that lowers or decreases the amount of bank reserves that are actually in the system. And it's the exact same thing if you take those deposits, your savings, and go straight to Janet Yellen at the Treasury and buy T-bills. Then the bank reserves go from the bank's account at the Fed down into the Treasury's account called the TGA. So regardless of where you choose to move your money, it's most likely going to make the banks, especially the small regional ones, have to compete more and more for your deposits, just like they did prior to the GFC. If you're not following along, I've got a legend for you right up here. Nada bank reserves means the banks are competing for your bank deposits, and therefore they're going to pay you higher interest rates. With mucho reserves in the system, then there is no competition for your deposits, so they're going to pay you a measly interest rate, if anything at all. So now that we've got the technical terms out of the way, let's figure out how this applies to the banks. Well, right now, they're basically paying you nothing, and that's the only reason why they have a steep curve to where they can actually make profit. If they have to start competing for your deposits, well, now all of a sudden, they have to pay you an interest rate. And the closer that interest rate gets up to Fed funds, which is exactly what we saw prior to the QE era, the flatter this curve gets to the point where it inverts. And if we get an actual inverted curve in the banking system, that's when we go into the next phase of this current banking crisis. Step number 2, we've all heard of quantitative tightening. And we know it's when the Fed reduces the size of their balance sheet, therefore reducing the amount of bank reserves in the system. And after step 1, you understand that if we reduce the amount of bank reserves in the system, it gets us closer to that point where those banks are going to have to start competing for your deposits. In other words, it takes them straight into the we'll call it the no bueno zone, where it's going to be real difficult for them to make profit. They'll most likely be unprofitable, which could take us into the next phase of this crisis. So if you zoom out, you start to realize that basically everything is quantitative tightening. Let me show you exactly what I'm referring to. So we've got the Fed's balance sheet right here. And the liability side, we've broken it down into three separate buckets or three separate main accounts. We've got the reserve accounts for all the banks, those bank reserves. And then we've got the TGA, the Treasury General Account that we talked about earlier, and the reverse repo account. Okay, we'll insert everyone's favorite whiteboard character, Moody the Millennial, with their blue hair. And Moody's pissed. I mean, you can't really tell right now, but trust me, they're extremely angry. Why? Because they're only getting that 50 basis points on their savings account, and they know that inflation is running at 6%. But of course, like we said in step number 1, this makes the fat cat bankers very, very happy, because even though the real yield curve is inverted, their, we'll call it bank yield curve, is still very steep, therefore still bringing in all of those dollars. But Moody has now woken up to the ruse. They're no longer going to keep their deposits in the bank. They're going to move them to a money market fund or buy T-bills, like we talked about in step number 1. So let's go through how this would work on the Fed's balance sheet. So if Moody decides that T-bills are the best option, let's say at 5%, instead of that measly 50 basis points that they're getting, well, they are going to buy them directly from Janet Yellen. Okay, so on the Fed's balance sheet, that means that the bank reserves from Moody's Bank, let's say Wells Fargo, would go from their account down into Janet Yellen's account, the TGA. So that would decrease the amount of reserves in the system. In other words, that's quantitative tightening. All right? Well, if Moody decides to put their money into a money market fund, because not only are they gender fluid, but they're also asset fluid. Very, very smart of Moody. So they put their money into that money market fund at 5%. What does that do to the Fed's balance sheet? So Wells Fargo would have to take the reserves out of their account, and the Fed would put them into the reverse repo account. So the bank reserve account for the commercial banking system in aggregate total decreases, while the reverse repo account on the Fed's balance sheet increases. You see, the Fed hasn't actually done QT throughout any of these steps. Their balance sheet is still the exact same size. But because of the actions of Janet Yellen and Moody the Millennial, who's basically a proxy for the average Joe and Jane, or the entities in the real economy, effectively, they have done the exact same thing. And I think this will continue to put massive amounts of pressure on the banking system throughout the rest of 2023, putting the Fed into a position where there's only one thing they can do. More on that in step number 3. So the conclusions we can come to from this step is that, ironically, quantitative easing has created an environment where there is such an extreme delta between what you're getting paid on your deposits and what you can get paid out in the open market with a money market fund or treasury, that quantitative easing itself has created quantitative tightening and money going into the TGA by Janet Yellen selling T-bills. Remember, she just said that she wants to take the balance of the TGA up another $500 billion. What would that do? Same thing, quantitative tightening. And we've seen the amount of money in the reverse repo account skyrocket to over $2 trillion. What does this equal? You guessed it, more quantitative tightening. Now let's go over some of these fancy equations that I have created to make sure that we're all on the same page. Quantitative tightening equals nada bank reserves, or at least fewer bank reserves in the system. And if we have fewer bank reserves in the system, that equals the banksters themselves having to compete for your deposits. Well, if they have to compete for your deposits, that means that bank curve we talked about in step number 1 becomes inverted, just like the real yield curve. And if that bank curve is inverted, that means that they're no longer making profit, especially those small regional banks, which again, most likely takes us right back into the next phase of this crisis we're living through in 2023. Step number 3, the Fed and the central planners have backed themselves into a corner, and there's only one way out. I'm sure all of you have been hearing in the news and on social media about this debate as to when the Fed is going to pivot. Is it going to be soon? Is it going to be in 2023? Is it going to be in 2024? Is the economy hot? Is the economy slowing down? When is Jerome Powell going to hit the pause button? And when is he actually going to start lowering rates? My base case is it will be in the next 90 days. So how does this play out behind the scenes? You know exactly what's happening right now. These banksters, the fat cats that were making all of this profit, now they're turning into the crying cats, we'll call them.
He's not saying, he's not saying to storm the beaches.
Because they're about to go bust. So they're calling Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen and saying, hey, you've got to do something. You've got to bail us out, or else the whole entire system is going to collapse. So that's when Jerome Powell gets on the phone with Janet Yellen, or Janet Yellen calls this emergency meeting so they can all get together, the central planners, the banking regulators, whoever they are, and say, okay, how do we solve this problem? Well, they've got to come to the exact same conclusion that we are coming to in this video right now. Basically, what they need to do is make sure that you don't have an incentive to take your deposits out of the banks. In other words, they need to make sure that you are getting screwed. So they come in, they drop rates, which brings that front end of the yield curve down. So then the banksters don't have to pay you much money on your deposits, let's say that 50 basis points, but you don't have any other option because now that money market fund is paying 50 basis points and T-bills are paying the exact same thing. Obviously, the problem here, like we just said, is that it goes back to that first chart that we showed in step number 1, where this is you, the average depositor, and the amount of interest you're getting is here, but the CPI, the inflation rate, is much, much higher. Therefore, you are losing purchasing power on your deposits. It's just another way for the central planners to steal from you to bail out their fat cat bankster buddies. And this is why I think, although there's no certainties, only probabilities, the Fed could pivot or lower rates within the next 90 days. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.